Kim says, I just bought a variable dent reed. Do you have any suggestions for what kind of project would be fun? So these heddles or reeds are known as dent reeds. And the idea is that instead of a consistent sizing all the way along, you have consistent sizing for a section, and then for another section, you have a different size. I don't actually have a dent reed myself, so I can't show you exactly what they look like, but I'll try and get a picture here somewhere. So the idea is that you can use variable kind of yarns in your warp, which will give interesting effects within your weaving. I think the kind of project that these are most suited to are something like a scarf or a shawl, because you can really highlight different yarns and they stand out really beautifully in a project like that. Another thing is a table runner or some sort of runner that lays out flat and displays the look of the piece really beautifully. So I guess what I'm saying is a display piece, something that is going to be looked at, where you can actually see the variations in the warp. Gwen says, is it a good choice to use the holes in both ends when warping? Yes, Gwen, it is a good choice, because what can happen is when you're threading, if you thread in a hole on one side and then you finish up threading in a slot on the other side, then when you start weaving, you might notice that your edges are different, and that can be frustrating. You can be weaving and that your left side is all very nice and neat, and then on the right side, no matter what you try to do, you have a kind of bumpy, lumpy looking edge. Really frustrating, but it's very simple to fix, and it has a simple explanation too. It's because the thread on one side that may be through a hole or a slot, and the thread on the other side that's through the opposite, they're under different tension. The threads that go through holes on a rigid heddle loom are always more tensioned than the slot threads. And so it makes sense that if you go ahead and thread in holes on both sides, you're going to have a much more similar tension on both sides, and weaving neat edges is going to be much easier. I have a video on how to do that here on YouTube, and I'll link to it down below. It's very simple to do, and it really does give good results. Kim's question is how to do mattress stitch. I also have a tutorial for how to do that. Rather than trying to explain how to do mattress stitch, because it's something that's really very visual, I'm just going to pop the link down below. What is mattress stitch? In case you don't know, it's just a stitch that you can use to join panels or pieces of fabric together, and it works really well for hand woven fabric. It can make joins that are really neat and lovely, so it's great for things like blanket panels, and it can be done by hand, so you don't need a sewing machine to do it. So if you're interested to find out more about the mattress stitch, check out the link down below for it. Lynn's question is that she wants to know more about hem stitching. Yes, this is a very popular topic in the weaving world, and it's not just limited to rigid heddle weaving, because we use hem stitching in all kinds of weaving. Hem stitching is a way to finish your weaving on the loom, and it serves a dual purpose. It stops your weaving from unraveling as you're taking it off the loom, so it keeps it secure during that time period. But also you can keep the hem stitch as a design feature if you're going to have a fringe, because it creates these little knots or bunches of warp threads that also hold the weft in place, but it looks really beautiful as well. It's a great finish, and it's strong enough to hold on its own, so you don't need to do any other finishing treatments to your weaving. You can just leave it as a hem stitch. You can then either leave a fringe of a certain length, because if you cut your fringe right up against your hem stitches, they are going to unravel. But if you cut and leave a little bit of length, a couple of inches maybe at least, or a longer fringe if you want to keep a longer fringe, those hem stitches will keep everything really secure. I have an awful lot of hem stitching resources, and so I'm going to leave, I don't know how many links down below, but I'll try to keep it brief and direct you to the most straightforward resources for that. So the next question from Juanita kind of relates to the last one. How do I create professional fringes? Okay, so one I just kind of mentioned is the hem stitch. It does look really classy. It's not bulky. So if you're going to have a fringe, that is a beautiful way to secure those wall pens. But then also, in addition to that, there are other fringe treatments that you can do. And by the way, there are different decorative hem stitches like the Italian hem stitch. I have resources for that as well. And there are other types of hem stitch if you want to do like quite a decorative fringe. You can leave the fringe raw as it is, just the threads coming off as they are, and that can be lovely depending on the type of yarn. Or you can do a twisted fringe. A twisted fringe always looks really beautiful. One tip that I have for you, Juanita, is anytime that you're going to do a fringe treatment, let's say you decided that you are going to have a twisted fringe, twist the fringe up when you get the piece off the loom before wet finishing. And the same for any other fringe treatment that you're going to do. Do that first and then do your wet finish, which will set the treatment in place. And then when you've finished your wet finishing process, whether you did an extra fringe treatment or not, so whether you twisted it or whether you just left it raw, you want to cut the ends really nice and straight with some sharp scissors or a rotary cutter. What that does is it stops any straggly ends, because putting it through the wet finishing process, you're going to end up with, you know, your yarns have shrunk a little bit, they've maybe tangled together a little bit here and there, they might be a bit fuzzy on the ends. That all depends on the yarn and your wet finishing process. But cutting the ends will give a good clean edge. It can make such a major difference. So here's what I do for cutting my ends after wet finishing. If I'm not twisting the fringe, say I've just done a hem stitch, I've taken it off, I'll lay the piece out on my cutting mat. I've got a self-healing cutting mat. I will use the big plastic ruler guide that I have for that cutting mat, and I'll use my rotary cutter. I'll line up and make sure I tease out, you know, finger comb through all the fringes so it's laying as straight as possible. And then I'll measure out on the mat, because it has measuring in like 1/2 inch increments. And so you can measure that out to the length that you want, and then go over that with the rotary cutter and make sure that your rotary cutter's sharp, and make sure you don't cut yourself with the sharp rotary cutter. They can be really dangerous. And then you do exactly the same to the other end, because you've already got the measurements for one end of fringe. So then you flip it around, comb it all out again, comb it all out, and then start all over again. Now, if you did a twisted fringe, you want to do something a little bit different. I take each twisted fringe bunch individually and I trim the ends off. And I do it so that they're all approximately about the same amount trimmed. But just to get that straight edge, it makes such a difference. Okay, here's Cheryl's question. She says, I'm pretty new to weaving and I taught myself the basic weave for scarves and I love it. I want to make dish towels, but I don't understand when people talk about what they use to make them. Is it the cotton that you get when you want to knit or crochet, or is it the cotton you use to make doilies, or am I totally wrong on all of it? I don't have a store in my area that sells stuff for weaving anymore. Well, me neither, Cheryl. I don't have any stores local to me that sell the kind of yarns that I use most frequently. So I order all of my yarns online. If you're in somewhere like the US, you're actually at an advantage because most places will do free shipping right across the States. So that's a beautiful thing. So as for what sort of yarn you should be using as a kitchen towel, yes, it is important to know the difference. I categorize the cottons into the hard wearing cottons and the lofty cottons. The lofty cottons are usually used for knitting, so they'll often be sold as knitting yarns, and they are totally fine for using with weaving. They're actually beautiful for things like blankets, kitchen cloths, hand towels, lots of those kind of things. For the kitchen towels that you want for drying dishes, I use one of the hard wearing rigid sort of cottons, like an 8-2 cotton, as I've used with this towel. You can see that it has a lot of movement, it's very light, but it's also very absorbent. There's a lot to this towel. If you use a lofty soft cotton and try to make a kitchen towel or a dish towel with that, you're going to have a few issues in a few ways. Usually they're too thick and soft to kind of use on dishes effectively, but also they tend to shed and be a little bit fluffy. So you'll probably end up with fibers on your dishes, and they're just not the kind of towels that you would use for dishes. So 8-2 cotton is great. 8-2 size Cotton, which is a blend of cotton and linen, is great, and 10-2 cotton is great. The smaller sizes in cotton are great as well, that are actual weaving yarns. I have a video here on YouTube about which cottons are best to use for towels, and so I expect you'll be interested in that, Cheryl, and I'm going to link to that down below. Wendy says, I'm just about to do my first warp on a warping board. What is the best method to change colours in the warp to achieve stripes? Good question. A lot of people ask this, and there are a couple of options. You can have different cones of yarn, your different colours, and you can run them at once and have them as a continuous warp. I don't like to do that. I find that messy. I find it hard to kind of process that mentally, because for me, it works much better if I finish off the yarn that I'm using and then introduce the new yarn. It just makes everything a bit smoother for me and easier to understand and see what I'm doing. So what I do for that is I'll cut off the last colour that I was using, and I'll cut it off at the top peg or the bottom peg, depending on, you know, how many ends I actually need of that colour, but I'll cut it off at one of the ending pegs, and then I will join in the new yarn. I'll do a double knot. Works really well. It's very secure. I don't think I've ever had one come undone, so it's not an issue for me. And then I'll just restart with that yarn, and I'll do as many of that colour as I need to. Again, I'll get to one of the ending pegs and I will cut again and change it from there. It's more time consuming to cut and knot and restart, but for me, I find that the most worthwhile method. I recommend that you experiment with both methods and see what's going to suit you best. Okay, the next question is from Laura. Can you explain what differences you get using a thinner warp and thick weft, and vice versa, and what gives the best effect for the differences? This is a little bit like a question that we addressed before about using different thicknesses of yarns in different situations. When we were talking about, you know, the possibility of having like a weft-faced piece or a warp-faced piece. So that just means weft-faced means weft dominant, more of the weft is going to show. Warp-faced means warp dominant, more of the warp is going to show. Again, sampling is a really terrific idea so that you know exactly what you're going to get. I do really like to play around with these ideas of different thicknesses of yarns. It can completely change the way a project looks. And I've talked about this quite a bit in finding the best ways to get your warp colours to show, because a lot of people will use, say, a hand-dyed warp or a variegated warp, and they really want those colours to show enough that they don't get toned down too much by the weft. And usually I recommend for those people to use a thinner weft than they used for their warp. Not only does it allow the colours to show more, but in something like a scarf, it also gives a beautiful hand to the piece, which just means it has a really nice drape. It's a really lovely, flowy kind of cloth, and not as thick as if you had used the same thickness of weft. So it's a little bit difficult to give a very specific answer to this question because there are a lot of variables, but I do recommend that you check out the resources that I have on that. That might give you some more ideas about what direction you want to go in. And as I always say, do a sample and that'll tell you what you need to know. Now, the next question, coincidentally enough, because I didn't plan this, is about drape. This question comes from Nate. I have a question about drape. This is something that I always struggle to understand. What exactly is a drapey cloth and how does one achieve it? Well, I started to explain this in the last question, but there's a little bit more to it as well. So the drape is basically how the cloth hangs. Okay, what I'm wearing at the moment actually is a really good example. I'm wearing a bamboo, what do you call this? Like over a cardigan. It's a long cardigan, but it's because it's bamboo, it has a bit of weight to it, but it's not super heavy, and it has a bit of stretchiness, and it's very soft and silky. And so I would say it has a beautiful drape, and it kind of, you know, it conforms to your body like a garment like this. It suits a lot of different body types and shapes because of the drape. It just kind of conforms to your own body requirements. So when you're talking about drape in hand weaving, as I said in the last question, it can come down to things like using a slightly lighter weft than your warp, but it also very much depends on your yarn. If I use a bamboo, if I use a tencel, if I use a silk, then I'm almost guaranteed to have a fabric that has a beautiful drape. But it's also the set of the fabric that is really important to drape as well. If you set a fabric really, really close, then it's probably going to be a stiff, thick kind of fabric. If you set it very far apart, then it might be a bit of a sleazy fabric, which basically means that the structural integrity is not so great because the threads are so far apart. But if you set appropriately for the yarn and the project that you're using, and the weave structure as well, that comes into it as well, then you will probably have a really nice drape. So I would say that drape is something really great to know about if you're interested in weaving cloth to make clothing, because how fabric behaves on your body is really important. Obviously, if I had a very stiff fabric, let's say that I tried to make something like this cardigan out of a tapestry fabric that's really thick and stiff and weft-faced and heavy, then it would kind of sit on my body like a box, you know. But if I use something like I said about a tencel, even a cotton set at the right set, then I'm going to have something that is going to sit on my body nicely and be complementary to me. Now, if you're talking about having something like a table runner, it might be desirable that a table runner is not drapey, depending on the type of table runner that you're going for. I've seen some beautiful drapey ones as well. But generally, when someone weaves a table runner, they want it to sit flat on their table and to be a little bit solid. And especially for something like a table mat, you know, like a placemat. You want it to be a little bit thicker. You don't necessarily want it to be ripply, have movement, be moving around easily on the table. So that's the sort of situation where I might not be going for a drapey fabric. Okay friends, that's all I have time for today. I hope answering these questions has been helpful to you. And of course, if you have more questions that you would like me to cover in a future Q&A, leave them down below and I'll make a list of them and make another video. Until next time, happy weaving.